What sort of texts are we producing? What sort of messages are they conveying? And what sort of collective identities are they fashioning? Meaning, what sort of communities are we able to imagine through these texts?
Of course, yung timeline, it asserts this sort of objectiveness. It asserts sort of structure and legitimacy ng mga bagay na nilalagay doon. Kasi it's appealing to a sense of history. Pero there's also something very symbolically violent about timelines. Kasi it offers a very specific type of narrative. Wala kang chance na mag-discuss doon. Presents a very linear na view ng history.
Welcome to Persuasion in the Polls, the rhetorical work of objects and bodies in the Philippine elections. This is a series of online discussions focused on identifying, describing, and analyzing political objects and bodies and their rhetorical operations in the 2022 electoral race in the Philippines. In this discussion, we will be examining a number of campaign-related texts and paraphernalia that have seen the light of day in this year's general elections. Some of these resources, such as the recently launched 100 Pink Poems para kay Lenny, published by San Anselmo Press in February, seek to represent those vying for national government positions in a particular light. In so doing, these publications not only serve as mechanisms to champion some political candidacies, but also, and even more importantly, become part of a large political machinery and a social civic movement that intend to influence and shape public discourse in favor of specific contenders. In what other forms do text-based campaign materials manifest? Why do politicians, particularly their strategists and supporters, resort to these measures during a campaign? And what roles do these textual materials play in the process of influencing voters to go for a candidate and ultimately elect him or her into office? I am Oscar Serquiña Jr., an assistant professor in the Department of Speech, Communication, and Theater Arts at the University of the Philippines, Diliman. Joining me in this discussion are two faculty members from the University of the Philippines. First is Assistant Professor Kristine Reynaldo, who teaches literature and composition in the UP Department of English and Comparative Literature. She did her PhD in Cultural Studies at Lingnan University in Hong Kong, writing a dissertation titled Tracing the Roots of Disjunction, Dutertismo and the Discourse of Liberal Democracy in the Philippines, which examines the problem of contemporary populist political violence and its contexts of emergence. Our second speaker is Mr. Rex Nepomuceno, who handles courses in public address and rhetoric in the UP Department of Speech, Communication, and Theater Arts. He's currently a graduate student of Malikhaing Pagsulat in UP, where he is completing his thesis on cartographic poetry. Welcome, Kristine and Rex, and thank you for agreeing to be part of this conversation. To jumpstart our conversation, could you identify some of the striking text-based resources that have come out during the electoral campaigns of 2022? Sige, Rex, ano yung mga nahanap mo so far?
Yeah. So, when I received the prompt, parang ang naisip ko rito ay to put a spotlight on paraphernalia that were distinctly textual, of course, pero with relatively unconventional forms. And sa websites nila, of course, ay maraming mamamine na ganitong types ng textual artifacts. For Lenny Robredo, yung website niya na lennyrobredo.com, very straightforward yung presentation. Na medyo nahirapan ako doon kasi ang problem is it's very hard to distinguish it from other types ng websites na may straightforward na presentation and plans, etc. So I tried to find other sources then or other paraphernalia na I think mas unconventional. And yun nga, it was introduced a while ago na maraming literature na na-produce recently na nagbibigay ng support para sa candidacy ni Lenny Robredo, particularly yung mga pinublish ng San Anselmo na publishers, yung 100 Pink Poems for Lenny. And of course, ito ay hindi naman bago to na na libro. Pero may comics na produce ang title ay Servant Leader This was previously published as a book, sort of pag-support kay Lenny before the candidacy. Pero this time around, transform nila into a comic book. Pero interestingly, with other candidates din, medyo may mga unconventional forms na ginagamit sila dun sa website nila. For example, Bongbong Marcos, heavily present ang mga timelines dito sa loob ng kanyang website, with a separate timeline for his political career, a separate timeline for his education, and then, interestingly, timelines for his disqualification case, timelines for his electoral protest noong 2016 na elections. And also worth noting siguro dun sa website din ni Isko Moreno, na tayo sa isco.com ay yung paggamit ng crowdsourcing, paggamit ng mas participatory function kung saan humihingi ng actual testimonies from the users of the website para supposedly ay ipapublish doon sa website na yun. So very interesting itong mga mga siguro mga I dare I call it mga experimental ways nila on presenting their messages.
Tin, ikaw, ano yung mga nahanap mo so far?
Okay, so when I was canvassing materials for this presentation, I looked at not just printed material like traditional texts or campaign materials and paraphernalia such as tarpaulins, posters, stickers, canvas, bags, mga pwede mong i-print na suot-suot mo ganyan, campaign t-shirts. So we're used to seeing these things because every election cycle, like we see people donning the clothing that is branded by the color of their candidate. But aside from those, what I would call more traditional campaign paraphernalia, I also looked at digital objects or cultural artifacts or texts that are meant to be circulated online that are primarily created for online circulation. So these are, of course, a lot. It encompasses all of the things that post online, share online, but I just listed some of the most significant things that I noticed more. So the first one would be hashtags. Before I continue, but I should probably say that I have not been following the campaign trails of all of the candidates. I've mostly been following the Lenny trail and the Leody trail. So I apologize for that limitation. I hope that Rex would be able to pick up some of my slack. So when I speak about these texts, I would be drawing mostly materials from these two campaigns, but actually mostly from the Lenny campaign. So the first one, as I mentioned, are hashtags. So for example, Let Lenny Lead 2022, Laban Lenny 2022, Rosas ang kulay ng bukas, Lugaw hindi nakaw, mga ganyang hashtags. And I'll speak more about why these hashtags are important textual artifacts. The second one would be memes. So examples of this would include quote cards, which the usual form is you have a picture of a person and then a quotation that they supposedly said. Or we also have memes like images with text that follows the format blank for Lenny. So for example, architects for Lenny, teachers for Lenny, mga poging bata for Lenny, mga ganon. So that kind of meme. Another form of meme would be the profile frames for Facebook, especially. And then we also have pink profile pictures, yung rosas thingy colors. Those are also considered as memes. We also have fact-checking memes. So for example, if you look at the Abacada page, this is a consortium of academics who fact-check fake news online. And if you look at other fact-checking pages, this is a common format of a meme where you have the first image or the left side image would be the false thing. And then on the bottom part or on the right side, you have the correction of the false information. So this is also another form of meme. And then you have what I would call warfare memes. And I got this term from Reddit, where Redditors or memesters look at the meme as a form of propaganda warfare. So warfare memes are meant to counter the other side, the opposition, or to put down the other side, like smear the other side. So these are also formats of those memes. Third one that I looked at are more traditional also forms of text-based political campaigns, and these are political advertisements and political speeches. So when I looked at these, I mostly referred to videos on YouTube. So even though it's a video recording, I still look at it as a text that can be read, especially because these videos feature captions. These videos often take the form of talking heads, where you have the politician just addressing the public. A fourth kind of text that I looked at would be infographics. So these are meant to summarize and interpret data and to distill complex information into a more easily digestible and visual form. So we often see infographics, for example, on Facebook or on Instagram. So these are also part of that archive that we can collect of campaign texts. Fifth one would include online discourse communities or networks publics. So these would include Facebook groups, Facebook pages, and the online discourse that happens within those groups and in those pages. We also have group chats and group messages on, for example, Viber or Telegram or Signal or what have you. We also have message boards or discussion boards. So for example, Reddit, mga tambay dyan sa our Philippines or our Lenny, mga ganyan. Or so we also have these message boards, and then we have the comments section of online publications, such as like posts on Rappler or posts on Facebook. So online discourse communities are also part of my conceptualization of what campaign texts consist in.
Right.
Sixth would include websites of candidates, which Rex already discussed. Seventh would include mga interviews, letters, and statements that are periodically released by camps. And then on the more traditional side, we also have literary productions, print publications, such as Rex mentioned earlier, like yung 100 Pink Poems for Lenny and Lenny Servant Leader, both published by San Anselmo Publications. And then there's currently a call for submissions for Lenny at Lipunan. And this is naman an anthology of Filipino language poetry for Lenny. So may call pa lang, wala pa yung libro mismo. So those are the texts that I've kind of mapped in.
Right.
Yeah.
So thanks, Ken, for giving us a very rich archive of political texts, no, available online, right? And what is interesting about this catalog is that we are seeing a variety of net-based textual materials that our viewers can possibly study, no, in the future. Now, texts are mutating in form and in content, especially in a very dynamic space such as the internet. But based on what you've surveyed, and you've surveyed a lot, right? We've covered websites, memes, quote cards, right? Even comments of people, right? To letters and testimonies. So what do you find extraordinary about the aesthetic and the arguments of these text-based resources? If we were to look at all of these materials as rhetorical artifacts, right, or channels of rhetorical messages, how are these artifacts, these campaign materials, structured as planned discourse?
Ina-approach ko yung particular na tanong na yon with a question of form nitong mga artifacts na ito as the problem of form as the launch off point para sa mas siguro political or rhetorical critique nitong artifacts. Kasi madaling sabihin na mag-focus tayo sa content and the thematic possibilities nitong artifacts na ito, no? Pero may very, very similar strand na dinadaanan, lalo na kapag panahon ng election and pandering to, big concepts and ideas na easily acceptable naman. So parang ang problem ko ay parang pare-pareho, everyone can talk about unity and progress, things like that. Pero very distinct sa akin yung paggamit nila ng certain forms at certain techniques ng presentation ng actual messages at content na ito. So let me go first dun sa artifact na binigay ko kanina tungkol kay sa candidacy ni Vice President Lenny Robredo. Yung poems at yung comics, of course, ay literary ng mga ng mga artifacts ito. And there is this sort of intellectual appeal sa forms ng comics at ng literature. The publishers nitong particular books na to, in an interview, they said that kaya transform into comics yung Servant Leader ay to get the youth vote and of course yung mas popular culture na type ng presentation ng pagkatao ni Lenny and of course the platforms. at understandable ito with the popularity, of course, of comics and literature. Ngayon, parang sa beer can sa halimbawa ay comics nila Rob Cham at nila ni Larry Alcala yung nakalagay sa sa certain beer ng brand ng popular na beer. So yung graphic narrative, yung visual performative na present dun sa comics ay totoo na may certain mass appeal din. And supposedly yung mass appeal na yon yung gustong makuha dito. But ayun I'd like to argue na yung mass appeal na to ay couldn't really be divorced dun sa actual na industry kung saan pinoproduce yung comics at yung poems na ito. And siguro for further discussion mamaya. Pero ang characteristics nito ay pinublish ng isang official na publication and binibili itong particular books na to with 200 to 300 peso na price tag dun sa books na yon. More than, yeah. And I think, sold out. Ayan, And of course, yung 200 at more than 300 peso na na price tag doon says a lot about din kung ano yung tinitingnan na market, kanino nagpapander itong particular na na artifacts na ito.
Right.
And yun, mas yun yung siguro initial thoughts ko dun sa aesthetics at dun sa production nitong mga literary artifacts for Leni Robredo. So ang pinuntahan ko dito kay Bongbong, yung website niya, kasi may primacy din on spoken at video artifacts, halimbawa dun sa sa Facebook page niya. Pero pagdating mo dito sa sa website, syempre may videos pa rin pero largely ay may gold mine ng textual artifacts dito. Pero interestingly, ang dami na timelines. I was mentioning this earlier, political career. I-present natin as a timeline. Yung education, of course, which has been a source of much controversy. Timeline din yung present. And interestingly, yung mga disqualification cases ay nakapresent din sa timeline as well as yung electoral protest niya. And of course, yung timeline, asserts this sort of objectiveness, it asserts sort of structure and legitimacy ng mga bagay na nilalagay doon. Kasi it's appealing to a sense of history. Pero there's also something very symbolically violent about timelines kasi it offers a very specific type of narrative. At kaya sinasabi ko na violent kasi wala kang chance na mag-discuss doon or makita yung discussion of the different points within that timeline. It presents a very linear na view ng history. At obviously, yun yung gustong makita dito sa mga timeline na ito. So, siguro more on that later on. Pero another artifact siguro galing naman dun sa website ni Isko Moreno, tayo si isko.com ay largely pagdating mo dun sa landing page nito ay of course ina-highlight ang rags to riches na story ni Isko. Pero ang highlight na pangalan mismo ng website tayo si Isko is a section wherein pwede kang mag-upload ng pictures or ng video mo pero ilalagay mo lang yung name at yung address mo and contact number. And supposedly, kapag in-upload mo yun doon, pwedeng isama yung testimony mo doon sa entire website ni Isko. Which is something na interesting kasi may sort of participatory crowdsourcing and very open at may sense ng confidence doon na parang hihingin mo from random netizens ang tingin nila sa candidacy mo. And so this communal shared open source na is worth noting then. Pero very misleading din sometimes kapag sinabi natin na open source, crowdsourced ang mga bagay. Kasi syempre ay very curated and filtered din ito. And of course, none of the spontaneous na type ng testimonies may expect mo from something crowdsourced. Siguro more later on.
Right. Maganda itong sinasabi mo, Rex, kasi ini-emphasize nito na yung aesthetic mismo ng mga text-based materials na ito ay nagiging argumento mismo, kung paano natin titignan at tatanggapin yung mga political candidates sa pagkapangulo, 'di ba? Kay Leni Robredo, yung aesthetic ng 100 poems para kay Leni ay isang argumento na itong sektor na ito yung gusto kong kausapin, 'di ba? At ganoon din kay Bongbong Marcos, yung paggamit ng timeline ay isang argumento sa kagustuhan ng kampo ni BBM na makontrol ang isang particular na kwento tungkol sa kanya. At ganoon din kay Isko, 'di ba? Na ang aesthetic ng crowdsourcing na meron sa website niya ay isang argumento sa kagustuhan niyang maging participative ang kanyang paraan ng pangangampanya. Okay, but I think pwede pa natin itong palawakin mamaya, no, yung discussion natin dito. Punta na tayo kay Tin. Tin, what are the remarkable features of the archive that you've seen online?
So kung si Rex looked at the particular forms that these texts take, what I focus more on the structures of mediation that these texts take, or how these texts are circulated through these structures of mediation, and how these structures of mediation form an ecosystem of texts. I guess, i-ankla ko yung discussion na yun sa paulit-ulit na lumalabas ngayon na keyword na participatory. And this is something that kept striking my attention when I was looking at these texts. Ang pinaka-kontextong mahalagang tingnan dyan is the state of the information ecosystem now. Whereas before, for example, 1980s, 90s, ganyan, na if you wanted to reach a large amount of people, you needed to go through traditional media, such as television, radio, and the like. So in order to reach that, the public that you want to reach, you have to go through these major media agencies, and then you needed to have money, or you needed to have celebrity. So of course, a lot of previous discussions have already talked about celebrity politics and the like. Whereas today, the information ecosystem is that it's no longer one way. It's no longer monolingual. People are able to speak back. People are able to generate their own content, and people are able to disseminate what they produce with very little money involved, often necessitated by that activity. So that's one context, yung entire information ecosystem and what the internet has enabled. Another important context for my mapping of this ecosystem here would be the concept of affective publics by ZZ Papakarisi, who is a media theorist. So affective publics are publics that come into being through the expression of shared sentiments in networks, platforms such as social networking sites, Facebook and Twitter. How do we understand this? If we remember the Warner's definition of a public, this is the audience that comes into being by virtue of being addressed. So if you create a poem, or if you create a video, and you have this public in mind that you want to address, that public comes into being through the act of listening, through the act of reading, through the act of paying attention. Now, Papakarisi builds on that theorization of the public by including the affective aspect. And in her study of social networks, she posits that the way that we congregate in social networks is defined by homophilic logics, meaning that we tend to connect with, speak with, interact with people who share the same things that we like, people who share our same views. So for example, yung mga pag-usap nung sa echo chambers, mga ganyan. Ganun yun eh, na homophilic ang lohika ng echo chambers. So when so for me, if I were a politician, my concern would be, how do I tap into affective networks publics? How do I get them to congregate in my name? So yun yung challenge for me. If the ecosystem is that I'm no longer the only one who's generating texts, I want to tap a public that will generate texts on my behalf, in my name. So ang isang mahalagang text for tapping into these affective publics would include hashtags. Kasi how do you find people like you? How do you find in this big space of the internet, diba? How do you find the people who are like you? So hashtag. If I want to find other discussions relating to my particular interest, I would use the hashtag. So the hashtag here performs a function of aggregation, that it allows you to collect multiple texts on various platforms, as long as these texts use that particular hashtag. Another factor that plays into this ecosystem would be the disinformation ecosystem. And we see the influence of that in texts like the memes, especially the quote cards, and the fact-checking memes. For instance, one of my students last semester in English 13, her name is Fatima Abuatiaya. She wrote her final paper on quote cards on Facebook. And the quote cards she looked at were Lenny Robredo quote cards. So specifically, she looked into how these quote cards were weaponized in order to make Lenny seem stupid. Kasi yung quote cards naman na yan, if we look at the form of the quote cards and the history of the quote cards, these used to be parang ano siya, evolution siya of the sound bites from earlier eras of mediation na may 1 hour interview si Mayor pero meron na tayong 3 seconds to show something on TV, so we have the sound bite. So nag-evolve siya in the online medium na yun na yung quote card mo, yun na yung sound bite mo. But the thing is that if you're showing a video on TV, tapos 2 seconds, parang may ano ka na may implicit assumption ka na of the possibility for verifiability kasi pinanood mo yung video, may mga ibang nanood ng video, may shared understanding kayo. Whereas the quote cards as a meme can be replicated and can be changed and can be manipulated.
So, maganda yung sinabi mong tungkol sa effective public spin, no? Na these textual materials online are also used, no, to aggregate people and in a sense create certain political communities, right, among people across, no, the nation or even beyond the nation. So I think the more pointed question here is now, why do politicians, their campaign teams, and their supporters resort to textual materials? Like, what are the motives or the ideologies that you are seeing, right, behind the proliferation of, say, this kind of website, right? This kind of literary artifact, or this kind of online material? Why do these text-based materials keep cropping up, right? Even before, but especially during electoral campaigns?
I think may mga bagay ako na gustong tutukan dito. Una ay legitimacy. Kasunod ay, and of course this has been mentioned kanina nga, yung reproducibility ng actual ng mga texts at yung sila napopropagate afterwards. Let me take for example yung literary artifacts, yung comics at yung poetry books from sa camp nila ni Robredo. Una ay nalilegitimize ng certain community yung mismong candidacy ng tao. Sino yung mga tao na kabilang dun sa actual literary publications na to? Of course, there are popular poets and parts specific members ng civil society and may mga national artists na nandun mismo. Halimbawa, dun sa 100 Pink Poems for Lenny. And this is a very middle class type ng endeavor. And that's being utilized. And ayun I think kung may sense of legitimacy doon sa endeavors na to ng camp, or at least hindi man yung mismong machinery ni Lenny Robredo but her supporters, I think yung aspect of reproducibility ay natatanggal dito. Kasi may clear distinction doon sa author at readers nung ganitong traditional na type ng texts. May mga popular and legitimate poets ako and artists na kukunin, and they have things to say para dito sa candidate na to. And as an audience member siguro, kailangan kong makinig dito sa mga tao na to. And of course these people, of course intellectuals and middle class. And there's nothing wrong na na ganun sila. Pero it says a lot about kung ano rin yung type ng support na nag-garner and ano yung type ng machinery na at least na-highlight sa ganitong type ng campaign. And I'd like to compare this naman doon sa it seems malayo yung i-compare natin yung mga libro doon sa timeline ni Bongbong Marcos. Pero yung timeline mismo ay may aspect ng reproducibility. Kasi it is self-referential about its own constructedness. Kasi kita mo na, ito yung lines, ito yung points. Alam mo kung paano ginawa, alam mo kung paano intindihin. And of course, walang authorship. Ito, At yun din yung nakakatakot eh. Kasi parang it's presented as truth na pwede mong gamitin at, i-reproduce at gawa ng different iterations pa. Ang dali na nakunin ang isang timeline at gamitin at ipaliwanag kaysa for example na gumawa ka rin ng sarili mong poetry or gumawa ka ng sarili mo na comics na para sa isang kandidato, And ayan, the timeline instructs the user on how to use it or use that particular artifact. At yun nga, yung binanggit ko kanina, to what ends pa to, syempre to present your very specific version of history. And if we go even siguro kahit dun sa content a bit nung timeline, minimythologize itong si Bongbong Marcos and the Marcos family, and syempre ina-isolate ang camps ng the receiving end ng kanyang electoral protest, which is of course Vice President Lenny. Ngayon, footnote yung kay kay Isko naman, crowdsourcing, supposedly participatory function. Pero when you actually see the videos, you see na very ironic na pre-produced, scripted, rehearsed yung mga videos na naka-upload dito, and trying to present himself as this version na cool, and it's trying to ride a wave of populism that isn't there. That's wave of populism na during low tide, something like that. So hindi siya makasakay dito kasi parang obviously binebetray siya ng sarili niyang paggamit doon sa technique na gusto niyang i-present sa website niya, na later on may gusto pa akong banggitin dito, pero yun muna I think sa ends in terms ng sa ends na gusto mo achieve ng specific forms na to.
Right, I think maganda yung pagdudugtong mo nung literary artifacts such as a poetry anthology and the timeline, because both, come to think of it, actually make use of narrative making. The term you used was myth making, Mm-hmm. Ang pinagkaiba lang nila, mayroong pangalan ng author yung literary artifacts na nandoon sa anthology para kay Lenny. Pero yung timeline, what you're saying here is, sure, it's under the website of Bongbong Marcos, but it's a timeline that's not bearing an origin. Like, sino ang gumawa, diba? Ang nakikita lang natin dito, bakit siya ginagawa? To present a particular version of biographical history, diba? Ni Bongbong Marcos. What about you, Tin? What do you think are the motives behind the proliferation of these quote cards and all of these statements that are available online?
So nabanggit na kanina ni Rex yung factors of reproducibility and the participatory nature of text making. Nabanggit na rin yung protean quality of these texts, meaning they're easily changed, they're easily manipulated. Unlike print text, which is pretty stable, online texts are more easily changeable. Tapos there's also the factor of portability na kung yung target audience mo walang access sa high-speed internet, pwede kang mag-post lang sa Facebook ng storya, tapos yung storya na yun ay magkakaroon ng maraming comments, mga ganyan. So these are factors that play into that. But in discussing like the narratives and the ends that are pursued by people who disseminate texts, I think what I would focus on would be yung mga political speeches and political advertisements posted by the Robredo camp, especially in October 2021, November 2021. So these include, for example, isang pinkiusap mula kay Leni Robredo, isang mensahe mula kay Leni Robredo. Robredo to supporters, reach out to others despite political differences at Rosas ang kulay ng bukas. So when I watched all of these videos, many things came out to me. Una, it's addressed to a particular public, which are the campings. And in early October, hindi pa solidified yung identity na yan nakakamping. Parang mas pa siya, inchoate na, okay, baka pwede tayong mag-pink today. Parang gagawin ba na, yun na ba yung branding colors ni Madam, magpipink na ba tayo? But by the process of addressing the public as kakamping, the collective identity comes to be solidified. And that's particularly important kasi given the nature of the current information ecosystem, chaotic siya, di ba? Hindi mo siya makokontrol. But if you want to kind of set the terms of the online discourse, if you kind of want to set the direction of the online discourse, maglalabas ka ng mga materials that helps in setting the terms. So in these videos from Lenny Robredo, there is a very distinct emphasis on statements like, ang pink ay hindi lang kulay, ito ay uri ng pamumuhay. Ang pink hindi lang dapat nakikita, dapat nadarama. Tapos may explicit imperatives na be kind to other people. Use language gently. Do not antagonize people. Treat people with respect. And I want to connect that to what Rex pointed out earlier about the underlying context of populist discourse that we've been dealing with since ERA, I would say, not just since Duterte, but since ERA, which is encapsulated by this thing that I actually really hate, yung bobotante discourse na bobo sila, so therefore we need to educate them. Now, we're in such a political mess kasi yung mga hihirap bobo. Yung mga ganyan. I find it really like a pernicious aspect of political rhetoric since the early 2000s na since mapunta si ERAP tapos yung mga supporters niya bobotante na, di ba? Tapos tuloy-tuloy yan hanggang kina Duterte at hanggang kina Lenny Robredo ngayon. You see slogans, for example, na nagva-viral online na, I think, therefore, I'm kakampi. Or yung mga TDS, bobo, or bayaran, yung mga ganon. Which fuels the populist divide in rhetoric. If we understand populism as discourse that rests on creating a social divide or antagonism, then such discourse na antagonistic nga fuels that populist divide and helps create populist publics na may explicit at very hard na tunggalian. So yung statements ni Robredo focuses on healing, I would say. Parang kung genre siya of K-drama, it would be a healing K-drama. Kasi may emphasis talaga on we should reach out to the other people, to the other. We should help. And that's what radical love is all about in the discourse of the Robredo camp, in the discourse of Kakampings. Radical love is about being kind to the other, even when they're throwing shit at you. Parang kailangan, and again, one context of that kasi nga yung populist discourse. But hindi lang siya yung populist discourse. Underlying that populist discourse, I would like to emphasize is yung class antagonisms that tend to be obfuscated when we adopt a moralistic approach to politics. Kasi yung isa pang makikita mo sa mga Lenny videos is the emphasis on Lenny as an incorruptible person. Yung parang kapag ang leader ay tapat, ang buhay nating lahat ay aangat. Yung mga ganon. Which is, if you recall also, parang what was emphasized in the Liberal Party campaigns in previous years. So this moralizing way of talking about politics posits a progressive leader as good and incorruptible, as if corruption is about the individual and not about systems, not about bureaucracies, not about structures. So yung class divide that tends to be parang glossed over by the discourse of radical love. It's something that we should not allow to be obscured. Kasi nandyan yan palagi.
Actually, maganda yung sinabi mo, Tin, no? Na yung mga divides na yon or yung mga biases na yon must not be obfuscated because actually they are channeled through the text-based materials that circulate online. I checked the quote cards that you showed, no, in our discussion, and I saw na meron doon a certain kind of pink methodology, di ba? Lenny Robredo, ganito dapat ang isang kakamping, magpakilala ng maayos, smile, di ba? Mas gwapo, maganda ka kapag ngumiti. Mas tayo sa angas, etc., etc., etc. So this is a pink methodology that is made possible or made viral by the quote card, right? That kakamping circulate online. So the quote card here becomes our entry point, not only into a kind of political methodology or how to campaign or how to approach a campaign, but also to a kind of political epistemology or a way of knowing of a certain group, right, of supporters, diba, who are endorsing a particular way of doing things in politics, or even legitimizing who can be part of that conversation, diba? And the kind of person, diba, that can be part of that conversation. I want to go to my next question, no? Given everything that you've surveyed so far and all the points that you've raised, what do you think are the possible impacts that these text-based resources might have, no, on political discourses and practices? Or to be more specific, on the candidates themselves, and because we're talking about rhetoric, and what rhetoric is interested in the accomplishment, no, of the goal of a certain kind of rhetorical practice, the Filipino voting public, diba? May impact ba ang website na ganito? May impact ba ang quote cards na iniikot online? How would we know that these textual artifacts or literary artifacts or online materials are generating a certain kind of effect or making an impact in the lives of the public?
I'd like to bank on dun sa point na binibigay ni Tim kanina about yung class nature din nitong particular artifacts na ito. Again, with the intellectual, literary, artistic na production at output doon kay Lenny Robredo, I think binanggit ko na ito kanina, pero nagre-represent of course ng middle class intellectual class na type ng sentiment. And I think ito rin yung pinagmumulan ng malaking disillusionment for the longest time ng Filipino people with regard sa sa mas liberal, sabihin natin, na type ng pamamahala at governance. The Filipino people experienced yung post-EDSA Cory at yung yung disillusionment na after ng dictatorship, tapos halos wala ring naging malaki at progressive na pagbabago na syempre kinikerry ng maraming tao yung yung disillusionment na yun. Pero I think very risky yung ganitong types, or not risky, symptomatic. It's baka hindi rin kasi sila conscious dito, pero very symptomatic to nung return doon sa very reformistic, very classes din na pagtingin na kailangan ay middle class at intellectual, at yung binabanggit nga kanina na uncorruptible na type ng ng figure ang mangunguna sa atin. And I think dito rin nagmumula yung sentiments ng certain voters, and I'm not blaming yung Lenny camp dito, na may against sa working class na type ng candidacies. And of course, I'm referring dito dun sa candidacy ni Calio de Guzman, na parang walang parang anong alam nito sa pamamahala. And I think na parang reflective yun, na parang ang kailangan pa rin natin is someone na educated, na nanggaling sa isang particular class na manguna sa atin. At syempre ang daming stereotypes na binibigay at tinutrato bilang nuisance candidate si Calio de Guzman. Pero hindi ko sinama dito yung mga textual artifacts niya, kasi limited siya sa Facebook at sa mga videos, at marami siyang speeches. Pero siya talaga yung nagfo-forward ng very radical na type ng ng discourse na hindi man prompted ay nagto-talk about agriculture and LGBTQ. So hindi pagkaka-inclusive yung dating ng kay Calio, but rather part mismo noong plano niya, ng comprehensive na plano, ito Pero ayun, yung class character even ng artifacts refers to kung saan ang sentiments at saan yung saan natin nilalagay yung hopes natin as Filipino people. At ganito kay Bongbong naman, nagpapander naman, not sa middle class lamang, kundi he's campaigning within a bubble, ayaw mag-engage, ayaw sumali ng mga debates. So ang gagawin, mag-produce ako ng easily reproducible na mga bagay na magpapander dun sa disillusionment, doon sa post-EDSA discontent na nararamdaman ng mga tao, at madaling masway ang mga tao dahil dun sa mythos na ito. Kasi very easy, dahil madaling i-reproduce, madaling basahin, madaling maintindihan. At parang lagi ko makikita yan sa mga sa pag-argue ng certain supporters and apologists, na parang ito yung nangyari nung pagkatapos ni Marcos, golden era, pagkatapos ni Cory. It's very timeline, and of course reflective ng timeline na pinopropagate din ni Bongbong Marcos. And lastly, dun sa Isko Moreno, dahil nga he's trying to ride a populism that isn't there, very superficial itong campaign na to. And one hot take na tawa ako na nakita ko recently ay kung sino ang totoong nuisance candidate dito sa election na to, it's Isko Moreno raw. Kasi sa paggamit niya ng superficial na alam na ng mga tao at nakita na doon and trying to ride the coattails of populism that just isn't working. So yun, siguro ito yung class nature lang siguro din ng texts na to and kung paano sila nagpapander.
Okay. What about you, Tin? What's your take on this?
Gusto kong sundan yung ginamit na term ni Rex on pandering. If we look at how these candidates construct their texts, you would see that they often tend to speak to their own publics. Parang majority is addressed towards their supporters rather than to the other side. And this could be contextualized, for example, by the awareness that right now we have fragmented publics in online spaces na you can't assume a unified people. Wala nang the people. You have multiple publics in various spaces and each space has its own distinct character. Parang yung mga kakamping sa TikTok, iba yung galawan nila sa mga kakamping sa Facebook at sa mga nagbabardagulang kakamping sa Twitter. So magkakaiba yung structures at practices niyan. So yung text-based resources nila, they address it or they target it towards particular publics and even towards particular platforms. So isa yon. Ang isa pang dun sa pandering, magandang tingnan, parang if somebody is interested in analyzing campaign discourse, it would be interesting to look at the texts circulating in various publics and what sort of interests they represent. So for example, yung kay Calyodi, yung tayo naman, manggagawa naman. So alam mo kung sino talaga yung tinatarget niyang interests that he presents as representative of his campaign. Yung kay Isko Moreno na tayo si Isko, ako si Isko, tas very personalistic yung treatment dun sa website niya, di ba? Na parang he's presenting an aspirational story of somebody who went from rags to riches. Tas parang ang story ay, you can also be like me, or the Philippines can be like Manila if you elect me to power. Yung kay Lenny naman, yung addressing the kakampings and this focus on love and care as the foundation of radical leadership, we can understand this imperative of radical love as a practice that constructs an inclusive group identity for kakampings and softens the borders of entry into this group. Kasi nga, yung isang konteksto nga niya ay yung social divisions na nag-surface at na-intensify ng pagkakaupo ni Duterte. So kung yung narrative niya is I am the healing president na bibigyan ko kayo ng trabaho, dulutasin natin ng COVID, aangat ang buhay nating lahat. You want to create a group identity that is as inclusive as possible. So yung what I might compare to fandom discipline, yung mga guidelines na ganito ang kakamping, ganito dapat makitao at makirelate ang kakamping. It's part of that strategy of creating an inclusive group identity that can propel Madam Lenny to the presidency. Tapos pag pinanood mo yung videos niya, sa dulo nun laging may exhortation na ang laban na ito ay hindi ko lang laban natin itong lahat. Or umaasa ako sa inyo, maraming salamat. So talagang yung binabato niya sa publics na we're in this together. This is not just about me. This is about all of us, and this is all about our collective contribution. So ganun yung identity na fina-fashion doon. Ayun.
Okay. Do you think seriously that these resources can make a difference in the run-up to May 9, the day when the Filipino people will cast their votes? Can these text-based materials matter? And can their various modes of production and distribution from print to online matter in how campaigns are conducted, in how political candidacies are shaped and ultimately marketed? What do you think?
Ako naniniwala ako na itong yung mga text-based resources na to, yung mga writing na napoproduce talaga is very important at totoong they matter in the larger sense ng candidacy at electoral campaign ng mga tao. Kasi kailangan din nating i-distinguish yung writing mismo from speech. Na obviously ay may primacy ang speech sa hindi lang sa context ng candidacy pero sa mundo natin, sa material world na meron tayo. Ang mas madaling mag-viral ay ang ang mga speeches ng mga tao at yung mga campaign ads nila na may spoken word talaga. And it's sometimes treated na yung written word at yung text ay representations lamang, copies ng mga spoken word na to. It's a very Saussurean na type ng pagtingin. Pero kailangan the distinctness ng writing at ng text dahil yung text ay consciously mo siyang tinuturo. Of course, the writing came way after nang natuto tayo ng spoken word at ay magsalita, and I think yun yung isa sa structures ng writing mismo na which makes it distinct and which I think necessitates yung critique na dapat nating gawin at yung hyper-awareness natin na magbasa at kilalanin yung capability of the written word at ng text. Kasi sa spoken word, kailangan yung interaction, kailangan nandiyan yung presence ng speaker at ng audience na nakaka-receive. Pero sa sa written word or sa written text, it doesn't matter kung present yung nag-produce ng text na yon at kung absent yung mga tao na makakarinig dito. Ingrained sa structure ng text yung iterability. Of course, this is from Derrida kung kinukuha tong yung terms na to. Pero it retains its function kahit wala na siya doon sa context na una niyang kinalalagyan. And that's what makes the text so scary at dangerous din. Kasi pwede mo siyang isupplant in whatever context na kailangan na pwede mong paglagyan, and to treat these texts that are divorced from context as truths, as authorless things and ideas na pwede kong isupplant sa sarili kong mga ideologies at pananaw. And the text is a constantly productive force. I think yun yung isa sa mga takeaways ko dito sa natin, sa discussion natin ngayon. And that's why nag-try din ako mag-focus doon sa doon sa form. Kasi yung form, hindi mo madadaya Parang pwede kang mag-produce ng content at ng message na almost hindi mo na ma-distinguish sila sa isa't isa. Pero yung view at yung pagbibigay ng alternative view, ng actual choice ng mga candidates sa kung ano yung gagamitin nilang form, kung ano yung gagamitin nilang structure, I think it reveals much more than simply the content or the message. The discourses, the social truths, the assumptions on the people and the voting public nakikita dito sa mga form na to. And I mentioned this earlier, any candidate could talk about peace and unity, pero not everyone would use the violence and assertiveness of a timeline to construct their own history. Pero the choice of form betrays the rhetor, and I think as scholars and critics from rhetoric and language, kailangan nating maging hyper aware di sa mga bagay na to.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rex. What about you, Tin? Do you think these can make a dent, right, in our lives in the run-up to May 9?
Following Benedict Anderson, texts help construct imagined communities na it's hindi na ngayon print capitalism, di ba? Sabi mga memes na, mga kwentuhan sa mga Facebook groups, yung mga pinupost na storya na mga na-touch na mga tao, yung mga ganyan. So all of these texts, hindi na nasa nobela yung locus ng texts that would create an imagined community. It's the archive, it's the aggregated body of texts that we all co-produce. So yung sa akin, will it make a dent in the election? Sa akin, ang tanong dyan ay, una, what sort of texts are we producing? What sort of messages are they conveying? And what sort of collective identities are they fashioning? Meaning, what sort of communities are we able to imagine through these texts? I've already mentioned kanina nga yung inclusivity nung kay Lenny, which is both a source of hope for me, but also a source of worry because of what that narrative of happy tayong lahat inclusivity tends to obscure nga, which is that yung slogan na angat buhay lahat, no, right? Because you can't have a fair game when you're not standing on even ground. Na kahit naman nung mag-economic growth ka na 6% tulad nung kay Noynoy, panahon ni Noynoy, di ba? If that economic growth is captured by a particular elite section of society, parang hindi siya angat buhay lahat. It's not that simple. So yung inclusive identity for me is a locus of hope, but also of some worry. And for me, what I would be interested in seeing is whether the participatory promise of inclusivity is realized. Kasi why are we being inclusive? Is it only just to get votes for the election? Or is it, do we actually want to empower people in order to enable them to pursue the lives that they desire as well, di ba? So yung participatory promise nung Leni Robredo campaign, whether that would be realized or not, that's something I would be interested in. Another thing would be how the identity of the kakamping as somebody who loves radically, yung marunong makipagkapwa, basically, marunong tumungo ng mabuti sa kapwa. So whether this identity of the kakamping actually results in a reframing of relations with other people in a more horizontal sense, or kung i-reproduce na yung hierarchical relationality that we see, for example, in the concept of charity. Na I'm higher up in the social ladder, therefore I will help you. I'm more educated, I'm more enlightened, therefore I will educate you. Kasi ganun yung hierarchy nun, di ba? Yung pagtulong na pababa or yung pag-educate na ng pababa. So, ang interested akong makita ay whether that vertical relation will be reproduced in the articulations of kakampings, or whether titingnan nila yung pakikipag-usap sa kapwa at pakikipagkapwa as an opportunity to see themselves in a more horizontal relation, na kakausapin kita hindi dahil gusto kitang i-educate, pero dahil meron akong gustong ikwento sa'yo at meron din akong gustong marinig sa'yo at maunawaan sa'yo. At gusto kong magtagpo tayo para doon. Hindi yung one way na tuturuan kita, di ba? So yung the promise of participation in horizontal relationality, that's what gives me a bit of hope in the campaign.
Right. Very good. I mean, we don't have enough time to talk more about the points you would like to raise, but it's been a rich discussion and sharing of insights that you guys have evolved based on your exposure to different kinds of text-based campaign materials in the 2022 Philippine elections. What I'm seeing from Rex is that the form is important because the form tells you not just about how campaigns are looking, but also how ideologies are being coursed through subtly or blatantly to different publics, right? And what I'm getting from Tin is that text-based materials, especially those that exist online, have multiple phases. One phase is they are good because they actually generate different effective communities, effective publics that can spark a movement, right? And change the course of the discussion and how things are being done during the campaigns, but also more especially beyond, right? But the other phase is that these text-based materials are also limiting and limited in that they almost already demarcate the kind of people that they would like to communicate with and the kind of people they would want to welcome into the fold. So in analyzing these text-based materials, it's not enough to just look into the dynamism of these text-based materials, the kind of mutation that they demonstrate online or offline, but also how they give ballast to existing conversations, but more importantly, challenge those existing conversations in order to open up spaces where imagination, different kinds of horizontal relations can take sway and play out in the world anew. So thank you very much to our panelists, Assistant Professor Kristine Reynaldo and Mr. Rex Nepomuceno, for sharing their valuable insights. This has been your moderator, Oscar Serquiña Jr. You can catch the other episodes of Persuasion and the Polls on the website Facebook page and YouTube channel of the Department of Speech, Communication, and Theater Arts. You may also like, share, and comment on this video. We would like to thank the UP Diliman Office for Initiatives in Culture and the Arts and the UP DSCPA for supporting this project. Thank you for watching.